Recently, I had the opportunity to visit the Scottish capital of Edinburgh, which is a lovely and vibrant city. There's a lot to do in Edinburgh, a city whose cobblestone streets and churches and museums, whose narrow alleys they call closes, and of course, whose impressive castle represents the true medieval charm of a 12th century royal borough. But one of the most popular attractions in Edinburgh is rather more modern than that, a symbol of a modern monarchy during a period of enormous change and of the life of a queen who was beloved around the world. The Royal Yacht Britannia, a royal residence turned into tourist attraction, first launched on April 16th, 1953, carries a long tradition that deserves to be remembered. In Scotland, a firth, a cognate of the Old Norse word fjord, means an inlet. The Firth of Forth, an inlet on the North Sea, is so called because inland the firth becomes an estuary of the River Forth, a name derived from Old Gaelic meaning slow running. ScottishPlaces.com explains that at some 55 miles in length, with a maximum width of 19 miles at its mouth, the Firth of Forth represents the most substantial estuary on the east coast of Scotland. And such many communities line its shores, and it represents a rich history. The Roman Emperor Septimus Severus had to build a bridge across the Firth to pursue northern tribes in an attempt to expand Pax Romana in the whole of the British Isles. The bridge, which historian Dr. Simon Elliott of the University of Kent says was built from nearly 900 boats, facilitated what Dr. Elliott calls Roman conquest as robbery with violence writ large. The victory, however, was short-lived as Severus died in AD 211. The strategic importance explains why the shores of the Firth were both settled and fortified, especially a particular volcanic rock intrusion that resisted the glaciers that carved the Firth tens of thousands of years before during the last glacial period. And so, Historic UK explains, stands above the surrounding area, a perfect defensive site. Historic UK continues that by 600 AD, the rock was referred to as Din Eiden, a Celtic word meaning roughly hill fort or region surrounding a hill fort, although the fort, or at least some type of fortification, might date back to the Iron Age. Historic UK describes the 7th century fortification as a Gododdin hill fort, the Gododdin being a Brittonic people. That stone and the area beneath it, where the stone had shielded a section of softer bedrock from the glaciers, is where the modern-day city of Edinburgh lies. The name is actually strangely redundant, in that borough, which was added to the name later, is an Old English word meaning fort or fortified town. And of course, a fortification still remains on top of the hill today, the spectacular and intimidating Edinburgh Castle, which has been a royal castle at least since the reign of Malcolm III, King of Alba, in the 11th century. But as a castle is, of course, a type of fortification, the name used today, Edinburgh Castle, means castle, castle, castle in 3 different languages. Of course, if you visit the city today, the castle is a must visit, although you might spend more time on the road that leads from the castle to the Palace of Holyrood House, or Holyrood Palace, the official residence of the British monarch in Scotland. It began as an abbey, now a ruin, built under the orders of David I, King of Scotland in the 12th century, followed by the Gothic palace that still stands today, built by Scottish King James IV in the 16th century, and today a royal residence of Prince Edward, the current Duke of Edinburgh and younger brother of King Charles III. The series of streets between Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood Palace are today called the Royal Mile, that although a 20th century moniker, has plenty of royal history, including entertainments celebrating the marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, to Francis II of France in 1558. The Royal Mile today contains many shops, attractions, as well as historic buildings of the city, and that is where an average tourist is likely to experience haggis and purchase an Angora scarf. And yes, I am wandering, but what fun is a travelogue without the history behind it, right? But I have left out a great deal of history of Edinburgh, and I might do that later. But anyway, when David I authorized the building of the abbey that would eventually be attached to the site of the palace, in that charter there is a mention of a coastal port called Inverleith, which represents the spot where the River Leith, the main river running through Edinburgh, flows into the Firth of Forth. Leith is a Brittonic word that means roughly water or maybe just moist, but in any case, Leith was a port of the city of Edinburgh, and there's archaeological evidence of medieval wharves being built there in the 12th century, roughly at the time that the abbey was being built. The town in the area has, of course, its own history, including being burned by the English in 1543. Burned by the English is a recurring theme in the history of Scotland, and also being the location of the Scottish court in the middle 16th century. Leith was the centre of a 5-year Scottish civil war between supporters of Mary, Queen of Scots, and supporters of her infant son James VI that was called the Wars between Leith and Edinburgh from 1568 to 1573. Leith has, however, for the most part been considered part of the city of Edinburgh, although it was made a separate burgh in 1833, only to be merged into Edinburgh again in 1920. Leith today, however, is a major port on the south shore of the Firth of Forth. In the 17th century, King James VI allowed the port to be used by Dunkirker pirates, the subject of another episode of The History Guy, and further proof, of course, that all good stories involve pirates. Incidentally, and hang on, I'll tie this together, I promise. A conflict occurred under James's, who was James VI of Scotland, but James I of England, as he followed Elizabeth I and was both King of England and Scotland, although the kingdoms were not unified at that point, but merely under a personal union, son Charles I. The conflict is popularly called the English Civil War, but it's more properly called the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, as it was a series of related conflicts that resulted in the capture and execution of Charles I in 1649. Charles's death was followed by the brutal Cromwellian conquest of Scotland in the 1650 to 1652 Anglo-Scottish War. And during the war, Scotland supported Charles I's son, Charles II, who eventually defeated, realized that he needed to win back the hearts of the people of England, and so, while fleeing to France, vowed that he would rather be hanged than return to Scotland. Charles II then spent 9 years in exile on the continent during the period called the English Interregnum. But a political crisis occurred after the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658, and in 1660 Charles was invited back in the English Restoration. The Restoration would have wide-ranging effects in England and Scotland, but one particular effect was a gift to Charles from the Dutch Republic. The Dutch gift was intended to strengthen diplomatic relations between the British throne and the Republic. The gift included 24 Italian Renaissance paintings and 12 classical sculptures, but it also included a ship, the Mary. Built by the Dutch East India Company in 1660 and purchased by the city of Amsterdam to be given as a gift to Charles, the Mary was a gaff-rigged ship of 92 tons, 50 feet long with a beam of 18.5 feet. The ship had a shallow draft and lots of sail, making it quite fast, and was of a type called in Dutch jagen, meaning hunter, and that is meant to hunt down other ships, although the English word for that was yacht. Built for luxury, the Mary was the first royal yacht of the Royal Navy. It was, of course, not the last. Charles II would acquire 27 yachts between 1660 and 1685. Mind you, depending upon definition, royal yachts might have actually dated back to antiquity. England had previously had boats owned by the king, and in the early 15th century, Henry V sold all the royal yachts to pay debts. Likewise, Henry VIII had royal vessels built, including the Mary Rose, but those vessels were more warships owned by the king. The royal yachts owned by Charles might represent a return to tradition, but are also seen as something new entirely, less a warship owned by the king and more a ship for use by the monarch and his family for both official and private duties. So, yes, you might not agree that the Mary was the very first royal yacht of England, but it was something different than what the kings had had before, and the first to bear the designation HMY, His Majesty's Yacht. And of course, England, or Great Britain after the Acts of Union in 1707, was not the only country to produce royal yachts for the use of royal families, and some still do. And that led to a competition of sorts, and by the turn of the 20th century, Queen Victoria complained that the Russian Tsar and the German Kaiser had bigger yachts. That embarrassment convinced Parliament to commission the Victoria and Albert III, the first royal yacht not powered by sail. The 420-foot vessel, commissioned in July 1901, had a crew of 336. The Queen, however, died in January 1901 and never stepped aboard. The Victoria and Albert III served for 38 years, serving 4 monarchs. But the Victoria and Albert was not built as a fully ocean-going vessel and never sailed farther than the Mediterranean. When the Duke and Duchess of Connaught went on a royal tour to India in 1902, they sailed on the pre-dreadnought battleship HMS Renown. The BBC notes, she subsequently took the Prince and Princess of Wales, later King George and Queen Mary, on yet another Indian visit in 1907, and was loaned to King Alfonso and Queen Victoria of Spain, all a far cry from her original function as a ship of war. Victoria and Albert III was decommissioned in 1939, and plans for a new royal yacht were abandoned due to the outbreak of World War II. After the war, with no royal yacht available, in 1947 the battleship HMS Vanguard carried George VI to South Africa, the first visit by a reigning monarch to South Africa. It became clear that the royal family needed a vessel that was capable of traveling anywhere in the world to support royal visits throughout the Commonwealth. Obviously, a battleship could not be expected to be held or maintained for such a purpose. The website of the Royal Yacht Britannia explains it was decided that a new royal yacht should be commissioned that could travel the globe. It was also hoped a convalescence cruise would help the king's ailing health. To justify the expense, the vessel would be built to easily convert to a hospital ship in time of war. The vessel was ordered from the John Brown and Company shipyard on February 4th, 1952. George VI died on February 6th. The Britannia website writes, not only did Queen Elizabeth II now have to prepare for her new role, but she also had responsibility for the commissioning of the new royal yacht. The new yacht, HMY Britannia, was launched April 16, 1953. The young queen was there to launch the ship, just 5 days before her 27th birthday. The Boston Globe reported Elizabeth broke a bottle of wine over its bow and made a short speech. The Queen announced that it was a necessity for the head of the Commonwealth, adding, between those countries the sea is no barrier, but the natural and indestructible highway. The website World of Cruising explains, arguably the Queen's first royal opportunity was playing an important role in the ship's design, and she relished the chance to mold HMY Britannia with intimate preference. The website Truly Edinburgh writes, both the Queen and Prince Philip took a keen interest in the design of the vessel, working with Sir Hugh Casson on the plans for the interior decorations. The young couple selected fabrics, furniture, and paintings, many of them taken from the Victoria and Albert III in an effort to keep costs under control. The ship and the Queen would have a surprisingly long relationship. Following her coronation in June 1953, Elizabeth embarked on a world tour, but the new yacht wasn't yet ready. The passenger steamer SS Gothic was used. In January 1954, at a cost of about £2.1 million, or $5 million US, HMY Britannia was commissioned. It would serve as a royal residence, as a diplomatic vessel, and even as the planned refuge for the monarch in case of nuclear war for 43 years. Martin Bellamy of the Society for Nautical Research explains, as well as being a sanctuary and floating palace for the Queen, it was a true workhorse of British soft power. Her maiden voyage was in April, carrying 6-year-old Prince Charles and 4-year-old Princess Anne from Portsmouth to Grand Harbour, Malta. There they were met by the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, marking the end of the royal couple's Commonwealth tour. Despite its lofty purpose, the vessel, and especially the living quarters, represented the personality of Elizabeth II. Henry Bird, whose father once commanded the vessel, wrote in the Times in 2022, the yacht possessed an inescapable aura of grandeur and royal ethereality. The interior itself, however, wasn't palatial. It was comfortable, even homely. The Queen was famously not a fan of change, and this certainly showed in the 1950s furniture and fittings that remained until the yacht's decommissioning in 1997. Despite being referred to as a floating palace, the yacht had the most understated interiors of all the Queen's residences. The ship was a royal workspace. The Tatler writes when the Queen was aboard, she would maintain her normal busy schedule, spending most of her day in the sitting room with her private secretary attending to official documents, stopping for afternoon tea at 5 p.m. before taking work to bed with her most evenings. Britannia hosted 968 state visits, hosting a wide range of world leaders, including Presidents Eisenhower, Reagan, and Clinton, as well as Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, and Nelson Mandela, as well as movie stars such as Elizabeth Taylor and Frank Sinatra. In 1986, Britannia diverted to rescue 1,000 stranded tourists from Yemen when the country broke into civil war. One disappointment, however, was the Falklands War in 1982. Despite being built to be able to transform into a hospital ship, by then the Royal Navy used a different fuel than the 29-year-old yacht, making it inefficient for service. But the yacht also served as a place for the royal family, where the Queen often said that it was the only place that she could truly be at ease. Fond stories were told of family life. Charles losing a soccer ball over the side, a skit performed by the Queen and Princess Anne during one of the cabaret shows regularly held on board. The Tatler writes that the Princess Royal admitted in a recent TV interview that it took a team of nannies to stop her and her older brother Charles from falling overboard as they got very excited about being at sea. The Daily Mail writes the Queen Mother used to frequent the mess bar to drink her favorite gin and Dubonnet, and then personally cook bacon and eggs for hungry crew members. 4 royal couples, Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips, Prince Charles and Princess Diana, Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones, and Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, honeymooned aboard the royal yacht. But the ship that had represented a nation fell victim to the nation's budget. World of Cruising writes, however, despite overwhelming success as an ambassador for Britain, it was becoming ever more difficult to justify the ship's running costs. Britannia had a yearly operating cost of £11 million, needed another £17 million per decade to keep the ship up to date. During a bleak financial time in the run-up to a general election, World of Cruising writes, John Major's conservative government announced the decision to decommission HMY Britannia. Britannia's last voyage was a mission of famous diplomacy, conveying Prince Charles and Governor Chris Patten from Hong Kong on its handover to China on July 1st, 1997. The ship was decommissioned on December 11th, 1997. Bellamy writes, unusually, the Queen attended the yacht's decommissioning ceremony, at which she shed a tear. During its 44-year service, it sailed more than 1,000,000 nautical miles to more than 600 ports in 135 countries. Britannia was the 83rd royal yacht to serve with the Royal Navy since Charles II's Mary, but the tradition might have ended with Charles III. There were plans announced to build a new vessel in 2022, but they were abandoned, and it doesn't seem that there are any further plans to build another royal yacht. No matter what you want to say about the cost of operating the yacht or whether it fits in the modern era, Britannia was an extraordinary vessel with an extraordinary history that deserves to be remembered. And she's still a beautiful vessel that you can see and tour today at the port in Leith, which is a fitting place for her, given both the history of that port and that she was a favorite of both the former Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, and the current Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Edward. You can travel Scotland with the History Guide, June 21st to 27th, 2026. Sign up at the link in the description. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of the History Guide. And if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share the History Guide with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support the History Guide as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo.